Hello guys, we have made it to episode 15 of my Factorio series, and for those of you who are current, that means you've hopefully watched episode 14 and 14.5, where you will have discovered that we talked about not only finding a location for the new base, but also those base plans. So if you haven't seen that video, I would highly recommend you doing that before we move on to today's episode. You can do that by clicking in the upper right hand corner over here, because in today's episode we're going to be doing things that I would normally put off for off camera, but I want to include you guys in the planning process, which means we're going to be starting with a calculator. We are starting off with calculators today because it is very important to have exactly my endgame science per minute goal in mind. So in episode 14.5, I did talk about the options of doing science per minutes of anywhere from 1,000 science per minute to potentially 3,000 science per minute. But I'm nevertheless using this calculator over here to the right-hand side as kind of a control. This is the same calculator I used in my 0.16 series where I was aiming for a goal of 5,000 science per minute. And while I wasn't 100% successful with that, all of my science factories were actually built to be able to potentially do 5,000 science per minute. So if I can look at these items per minute and even belts and the number of assemblers that go next to it, that might give me a better idea if I can compare it to the left-hand calculator over here about how feasible it is to be able to fit the type of factory I would need into the type of space that I would need for the upcoming series. So the left-hand side calculator over here is currently set to 2,000 science per minute, although that can easily be adjusted to 2,500 or 3,000 or any other rate that you want to place in this section over here. Just put it for each of the sciences, and then you can also easily modify the types of modules that you have in your factories, as well as the baseline assemblers that you're going to be using for your factories, and then how many beacons and what modules you put in the beacons for that. So currently with the calculator set to 2,000 over here to the left and 5,000 over here to the right, I remember just how massive my factories had to be, for instance, to meet these ratios. As an example, the low density structures for my 5,000 science per minute base took 4,000 plus low density structures per minute just to keep up. But meanwhile, at only 2,000 science per minute, it would only require 1,628 low density structures per minute. So that definitely seems a lot more feasible. That would only take 160 assemblers of the assembler 3s versus 401 assemblers over here to match 5,000 science per minute. So it is possible, I think, that if we just plan our base big enough that we could possibly get away with either modifying my current factories, just scaling it down to meet a ratio closer to the left-hand side, or coming up with a new design that happens to fit more compactly in the footprint that I'm thinking of. We're going to be jumping around quite a bit this episode because now we are in my creative world. This is the first time I've been in creative mode since 0.17 has been released, but I'm here for more demonstration purposes than anything. So zooming out here, this might look a little bit familiar for those of you who followed my 0.16 series. This is my original design for low density structures. Again, I'm going in theme with what we talked about on the Kirk McDonald calculator. So again, for 5,000 science per minute, this took over 4,000 low density structures per minute to keep up with that rate. And this factory was a beast. It took so much steel and obviously very big. And it's probably one of the biggest factories that I ended up having on my series. So I definitely don't want to plan this big again, at least for this series now in 0.17. But now looking over here to my left, you can see that using basically the same type of design, I was able to scale it down. And even with the changes to the recipes for 0.17 with the increase in copper compared to the previous ingredients, even with this setup in this smaller blueprint, I am meeting that 1,628 low density structures per minute that is required to keep up with 2,000 science per minute. In fact, I'm even producing above that. Over a 1 minute period, I'm actually producing 1.8 thousand per minute, and that is okay by me. I would much rather overproduce than underproduce. So ultimately, this is just an example to prove that it is possible to take pre-existing blueprints or come up with a new plan altogether to end up getting a 2,000 science per minute rate while still condensing my overall footprint significantly compared to my previous series. And hopefully that means the idea I talked about in my 14.5 episode just might be viable. Well, at this point, I'm really considering myself as having two options with moving forward with the design and planning process for the base. Option A would involve basically looking through my old blueprints and either modifying them to accommodate the current recipes, or coming up with new blueprints altogether to accommodate a 2,000 science per minute base, or 3,000 if I felt like it, or something in between. Even 1,000 science per minute is an option if I feel like I won't be able to fit everything like I want to. The advantage to that plan is that every factory that I make is essentially a puzzle piece, and I would be using them to basically end up fitting together into one big puzzle at the very end. And that way I could guarantee that everything fits precisely. Option B, though, is a bit riskier, and the reason why I say that is because it would involve just kind of hoping that I could plan out the base first, and then plan out the other factories that will go in it as we go along. The downside to this plan, however, is that if I end up not planning out the shape of the base big enough, and my factories are too big to fit in it or around it, then there's really no going back. Oddly enough, I think I'm actually leaning towards this option because I feel like if I go with option A, I'm going to be spending the whole rest of the series just playing the late game before I even really get into playing the mid game in my real series. So with that said, that means the next step I'm going to be doing in this episode is coming up with the overall shape of the future base. What I mean by that is, referring back to the picture as a guide, I need to think about how big I want my inner and outer circles to be. I've already tried to get an idea of how big my scaled down factories will have to be, which is why I took a look at the low density structure factory as an example. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to scale down everything a significant amount, or at least come up with something a little bit more compact when coming up with the new blueprint altogether. But the other thing I want to do is take a look at some circle pixel creators. There are a couple online. The one I have used most often is called Plots. But there is another one called Pixel Circle Generator, which actually has the ability to expand further than Plots just does. I think the max Plots has is 250 tiles in diameter or something like that, and I haven't seen a max limit on the other one. So let me take a look at those generators real quick, and then I'll come back and let you know what I've ultimately decided upon. Alright guys, I think I've got it figured out. I ended up going with the Plots circle generator because it was a little bit easier for me to use, and you can actually zoom in and see exactly which segment has so many tiles, whereas the other generator isn't quite that sophisticated, even though it can produce a bigger circle. But I think the circle will be plenty big enough, and I'm not talking about this little one that I'm standing in the middle, but let me zoom out here so you can see it. And we can't even see it in the full frame here, but looking on the map you can see it here. And then here's the actual map view. It is just ginormous. So the radius is 256 tiles long, which means the full diameter is 512 tiles long. So that is pretty big, hopefully big enough. But once I started playing around with this shape here, I got the idea that if one is good enough, why don't we play with 3? So let me head down to where I've got 3 ready to go, and then we'll take a look at that. And to point out the obvious, we're now looking at not 1, not 2, but 3 circles fairly put together, and I think this will make the overall shape of the base. I know in my previous episode, 14.5, I talked about just 1, but I did say that was inspiration for my overall plan, and doing the 1 is just not nearly as cool as doing 3. I mean, this gives me so much potential for future factories. I have more potential for bigger factories, maybe even more science per minute, so I'm not necessarily confined to do only the lowest amount I can get away with. So basically, this just opens up more potential for me than just one solid circle. They kind of look like Pokeballs or something, but I think I have a lot of potential for not only making it even more creative, like we can move some walkways around and we can do a lot of cool things with that, and we can add some really cool artistic features, I think. Over here, I'm already trying to think ahead of where I want my scrolling banner, for example. It's not turned on currently. There's a couple bugs I've got to fix in that, but I've already planned to make room for this in this upper area over here. And then I'm even planning on exactly where I'm going to be having enough room for some walkways if we want to keep it exactly like this. I do try to keep them at least 4 tiles wide, and this is 4 tiles wide all the way around, except for the little circles here in the middle, of course. But I think this will be really cool. The one logistical, I guess, nightmare, if you want to call it that I'm worried about is if and or how I would need to transfer resources from one of these car belt traveling things to the other circle. There might be a way where I can just use inserters to take from a car, for example, that's on this circle, and then transfer it, over here to the other circle, for example. But I haven't gotten quite that far yet. So I think before I consider this to be exactly the final shape of the base, or it's in stone as my plan, I do want to do a little bit more research about the car mechanics, because the car, like I said, is going to be traveling just along here. Actually, let's go to a spot that is a little bit more filled in, which is down here below. Only a quarter of it was done. Oh, there we go. Here's an example of the car, but we'll start all the way at the bottom. There we go. So basically, we'll have hundreds of cars traveling along like this. We'll use some circuitry mechanics, where's my wire right there, to put like a pause on the belt, just like that. And it will hold it for a couple seconds, just like we did with the car smelter in my previous series. And that way we can have a filter inserter unload the products like this here, and then have it go to the factory that needs it. So I need to iron out those mechanics, like I said before. I'm fully committed to this base design, but if I can get this to work, I think this would be probably in the running as one of my favorite bases that I would have ever designed. I know it's got a lot of similar mechanics from my previous bases, like I know I've done a circle bus in the past, but of course nothing quite like this. So let me get to work on finalizing the logistics of the base, and then I'll be back in hopefully just a minute. In the meantime, here's an intermission showing how I went about to actually building the circle. Again, I used the plots circle generator, but you basically have to lay down tile by tile, and then I plan on connecting all of the kind of loose belt pieces together. But I would highly recommend that for those of you guys who want to be as crazy as me and follow this along, that A, you look at the generator, and B, you definitely measure multiple times, because it's one of those things where you want to measure twice, cut once type of thing. You want to be sure that you get it 100% right on the final go around, or else it's going to be uneven or not symmetrical. And of course, if you're like me, that's not what you want. Some helpful tips: make sure you can test the symmetry by using your blueprint feature, and just find somewhere that is like halfway in the middle from side to side. And then once you have the blueprint, it should evenly line up on the other half, just like it did there when I overlay it. So that's a good way to test it. But like I said, let's get back onto the video. This is testing take 3. The car I just sent off has iron plate in it. This one does not, which is why it's blinking. And this one also, because it's not blinking, does have iron plate in it. And hopefully it should filter off going from one circle to the next with this junction I have up here. So again, this car is the one with the iron plate. There we go. So that kept moving along to the inner circle here where I am. That one went upward, and this one Phew, that made it. That is awesome. So we can use a technique like this for filtering out cars to different circles, basically. I still need to do a lot more testing, but this is using a Lazen's feature, which he figured out with basically how to move directions for the cars. So all credit goes to him for that. The information for his design is linked in the description box down below. I just need to tweak this and make sure that I could get it to work for my purposes and do a little bit more testing, like I said, but I am feeling a little bit more confident with this whole circle idea. After doing a little bit more testing, I think I've got it figured out and how I like it for the most part. So again, all of these cars that are not blinking have iron plate in them. And I've tested it with even only a single iron plate versus several stacks of iron plate. And these will all make it continuing on to this bottom circle, whereas other cars in it that would be blinking would move along to the upper circle like we have with this car over here. I did notice that there were a couple problems where if the cars were too close next to each other, it would be too quick for this filter insert to read the car, so it would allow cars with iron plate to continue on to the upper circle where I didn't want it to go. So I ended up adding in another circuit condition on this belt line here, which basically just adds a little bit of a pause to slow down the cars if there's not enough of a natural distance between them. So that way there's absolutely no hiccups with the cars going on to the correct circle where it needs to go. Even after all this testing, I'm not saying that this little filter car belt thing is something that I would end up implementing in my actual base, but it's something that I'm open to playing with and kind of tweaking a little bit further to see if it is something I want to do. But I think regardless, I'm pretty convinced that I want to go ahead and proceed with this car belt delivery setup thing for my actual base setup in my real map. So I'm going to go ahead and blueprint this, and then we're going to start building it. Here's the blueprint. It's pretty massive, and unfortunately I don't have the InfiniZoom mod, which was something that I used a lot in my 0.16 series. That has not yet been updated for the 0.17 update. I know there's a couple other mods that allow you to zoom out further, but I'm just going to be doing it without the benefit of having the zoom out option when I take this over to my main map. There's a couple of things in this blueprint here that I will get rid of eventually, like this section over here was for testing purposes, same with this thing over here. This is the car filter thing over here, which we might add just later or not at all as an option. And then my light scrolling display we can add way down the line. That doesn't have to be a right away thing. But I'm going to go ahead and create the blueprint, transfer it over here to my blueprint library, and I think this will actually be a good place to end, where in episode 16 we'll go ahead and actually take that blueprint, place it down somewhere in my real map, and then we can start building it there. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It was definitely a lot of talking and explaining and testing and designing, but by next episode we'll actually be able to start building. I hope to see you guys then.